The following program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts.
About money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared on the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
It is Friday afternoon, and we're going to be talking about money. We're going to begin with 1987. It was a special year in a number of ways. You know, you had the crash of October 19th, 1987, and that led to a big push for financial planning. Not so much for the clients, but to gather in assets for one of the companies. And I'm going to talk about that later in the program. Where all this idea of financial planning, which I think there's some major issues with. It didn't work in 2008. I think there's some very good reasons why it didn't. But I'm going to come back to that later in the program. But 1987 was another year that I went to a conference. And I'm going to tell you about that conference. I'm going to tell you about my guest who is related in some ways to that conference, related to the medical field. You want to hear what he has to say. He's got a very, very interesting story, a very interesting company. But 1987, let me return to that. I was just getting started in the brokerage business. I licensed in June of 1986. And later in 1987, after I'd been in the business for a year, I went to a conference. It was a controversial presentation because it was about biotechnology, which was a very, very controversial field at that time. It was not given very much credence by a lot of people. You know, the main analyst at the conference was the main healthcare analyst from Paine-Webber. And I remember he put up the chart for Merck. And he talked about it from, from 1930s or 1940s, whatever it was. Put up the chart, and they had gotten a 12% compounded return on an investment from that very beginning of time. He talked about it being a solid investment. And he mentioned that the issue for biotechnology was there had only been one injectable drug that had passed $1 billion. And all these big pharmaceutical companies had billion-dollar drugs. And it was very unlikely in his opinion, that we were going to see many biotech companies with many very big drugs. They might have a few very small drugs, maybe 100 or 200 million, but nothing like the Mercks, the Upjohns, the Johnson & Johnson, the big pharmaceutical companies of the day. You know, at that conference, there were 8 biotech companies that were presenting. Genentech was there with tumor necrosis factor. Centocor was there presenting about monoclonal antibodies. Cetus was there. And Amgen was there. And, you know, I had a degree in math and my master's in business, and I'd worked for an aluminum smelter before getting into the financial business. I didn't have a lot of background at all on biotechnology. There was only one company that I really understood. Well, I didn't really understand, but it made sense to me, and that was Amgen, that had this product that had been manufactured from urine, a product called Epogen at the time. No, it wasn't called, it was called erythropoietin at the time. And it was manufactured in such a way that it was being given to kidney dialysis patients. It was being given for 3 months. And you had a control group who were receiving a placebo for 3 months, and then they were switching the two. And the idea was to build the red blood cells without kidney dialysis. And so it seemed to me that was a very straightforward thing. Either the red blood cells would be there or they wouldn't be there. And they'd already shown pretty well that it was safe to do. So it seemed logical to me. Well, you know, Epogen, erythropoietin, went on to be a multi-billion-dollar drug. Their second drug, Neupogen, went on to be even larger than that. And they would end up buying Immunex from Seattle and building a multi-billion-dollar company, something that was not at all expected in 1987. But that was the traditionalist view, was that the biotech companies were going to have a lot of small stuff, but it was going to be the big pharmaceuticals. And that got me to thinking about what went on in the big pharmaceuticals. And so I want to share with you how we got to where we were. Because in 1918, World War I was ending, and there was a pandemic that was taking place, Spanish flu. It would kill 22 million people. It was a terrible strain of the flu. Nearly twice as many people died from that Spanish flu as died from World War I. You know, and it wasn't a flu bug itself. It was very often the after effects. People caught pneumonia, and the bacteria filled their lungs. Many died within 48 hours after their first cough. They would cough, their lungs would fill with fluid, and they would die. It was, while infections had been understood for over 40 years, there were no drugs available to treat it. The body had to respond by itself for those that lived. And if the body didn't respond, you died. There was no better response to the Spanish flu than there had been with the Black Plague, which took a third of the population of Europe. So people began to work with this. And in 1928, there was a Scottish guy, Alexander Fleming, who was working in his laboratory and trying to figure out what caused the Spanish flu and if there was something to cure the Spanish flu. And he was, in those days, you didn't have the huge laboratories that companies have today. He was just working in his house in his own little laboratory, which maybe not was so little. I don't know that much about that, but he was working at his house. And he decided to go on vacation. He left open one of the windows because it was hot in Scotland. I think he was in Edinburgh. It was hot. One of the windows was left open. And when he returned from vacation, there was this green moldy stuff that had contaminated a petri dish or several petri dishes. But that green mold had killed the virus which was causing the Spanish flu. So he made that substance, that green substance, into something that was pure, and he called it penicillin. That was the first drug that was developed. And he used that penicillin, injected it into animals, and it worked. You know, eventually he gave it to a London policeman, and it worked for him as well. That discovery launched the drug industry. But penicillin was difficult. Molds were temperamental. The yields were very low, and isolation of that green mold was very difficult. Extraction became very, very difficult. And it wasn't until the 1940s that penicillin was made in volumes. So you can look at this. Discovered in 1928, it was the 1940s before it finally becomes done in volume. But that led to this whole drug discovery, an idea of finding substances in nature, molecules in nature, which would react with a disease target. And you talk about the searches that went on for products. It was huge. The drug companies would go out and take samples of soil, of plants, they were looking for unique molecules, isolating unique molecules, and building libraries of molecules to test against drug targets. I can remember in that 1987 time period, companies advertising that they had libraries of 14 million molecules. 14 individual molecules that they could test. They had isolated, and they had automated machines that would run a drug target against 14 million different molecules to see if there was a response. And then if there was a response, they would take that molecule and they would begin to develop a drug. And that's what we did until the 1980s. That was the way of drug discovery. That's how all these great drugs that the big pharmaceutical companies had, that's how they came into existence. It was a trial and error. Not just one guy trying to do it, but automated machines targeting many, 14 million, 18 million, I don't know how many molecules that they identified. And they would look all over the world trying to find unique molecules. That's how we ended up with the big drugs that existed in 1987 when I went to that biotech conference. Every single one, except for those companies, had been discovered that way. But in 1987, it seemed to me that we were on the threshold of a real breakthrough, that we were on the path of something that was going to revolutionize what we did in healthcare. And it did. Today, there's a number of companies that are doing billion-dollar products that were built through that whole process. I'm going to tell you more about that when I come back from this break, and we are coming to a break. It's a very interesting story and has application and way beyond healthcare as well. But we're not going to get to that. We're just going to talk about healthcare today. Don't go away. We're coming to the break. After the break, I'll be right back.
Stay tuned. About Money returns in a moment with your host, Mike Adams, here on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Lots of people manage investment portfolios. Just a few can manage a successful portfolio and provide exceedingly great service to their clients. Here's Mike Adams from Adams Financial Concepts.
We believe the price you pay should be based on the performance of your portfolio and the quality of service you receive.
You know, Mike, it seems that a lot of companies subscribe to the one-size-fits-all mentality of investing. Does one size really fit all?
Not with us. Every portfolio that we manage is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. We place our client's interests first in all portfolio decisions.
If you're looking for a home for your seven-figure plus investment portfolio, call Mike Adams of Adams Financial Concepts, specializing in creating and maintaining wealth for over 20 years. 206-903-1019. That's 206-903-1019. Or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So, I've been talking about the drug discovery process from the time that the reaction to the Spanish flu in 1918 that took so many lives, through the discovery of penicillin, to the trial and error discovery of drugs that the big pharmaceutical companies had until the 1980s. To get a drug approved, there's a process. You identify a drug candidate, you do all these things, you test it in animals. That's preclinical. Then you take it into phase 1 clinical, where you test to see if it's safe to give. A phase 2, you test the effectiveness, the dosage, the efficacy. And then finally in phase 3, you do generally a huge clinical trial to see if the drug really works. And that leads to an approval, you hope, if you're a drug company and you're testing a drug. In 1965, however, there was something that happened that changed what we have today. There was, and I remember 1965, and it was probably before 1965, but I remember in 1965 the cover of Time magazine, which had a picture of this helix with Watson and Crick. And how many times have I said, I looked at that magazine and thought, so what? Was I crazy at that time? But it would lead to biotechnology. In 1973, Cohen and Boyer showed the way to recombine DNA, and genetic engineering was born in 1973. The focus was on insulin. It was it was well understood, And Genentech the first company began to make synthetic insulin. They licensed it to Eli Lilly, one of the major pharmaceuticals, but that began a whole new work. Monoclonal antibodies. You took a myeloma cell and with an antibody producing cell, and you made a monoclonal antibody to treat diseases. All of that began genetic engineering, which led to many drugs today. It was a change from the first trial and error to discovery of how to manipulate genes and what we called chromosomes in those days. We know DNA, RNA, to begin to manipulate genetically cells and parts of cells. It was the beginning of biotechnology, and yet it's not an easy process. I remember Lee Hartwell, who received the Nobel Prize actually. He was defining the yeast cell, and he talked about the process of what it's like. He said, it's like having a company that employs 45,000 people and trying to write job descriptions when the only information you have is what happens when somebody is absent from work. Try to write that person's job description. That's the process of what we're trying to do in determining what genes do and how they work. But the process is ever increasing, ever more rapidly. We're finding out what happens. Along that process, not only did we begin to manipulate genes, we began to create, when you take a large molecule, the way it's folded makes a difference. If it's folded to the right or to the left, the way in which that whole molecule is put forward. There was a company, Aguron, that began to actually do molecule design, drug design, by designing specific molecules. I would bet that over the next 20 years, we're going to see drugs that are designed that will attack viruses, that will attack many of the diseases that we have today, and those diseases will disappear. I heard the head of the Fred Hutch, the new head, talk. They're not talking about treating cancer. They're talking about curing cancer. I mean, it's a phenomenal kind of thing that's going on. We live in a world in which many diseases are probably going to disappear in the next 20 to 30 years. Think about it. That's an incredible advance. You know, my focus on this program is to give you, the listener, greater insight and to put you ahead of the curve and understanding where we're going so that you can make better investment decisions. And I want to share something with you. I had an emergency appendectomy just about a year ago, and it was done laparoscopically. And as I shared that afterwards with a number of people that had also had appendectomies, some of them had appendectomies 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, I don't know how long ago, where they talked about having to be cut open, spending up to 7 days in the hospital recovering, and having some pain from that whole process. It was a long recovery time. Mine was done laparoscopically. They cut 3 holes, one through my belly button and 2 others, and they put in cameras, and they went in and they took the appendix out. I had my surgery at 8 o'clock on a Friday night. I was released from the hospital early the next morning, and on Saturday afternoon, as I was sitting at home, we had invited clients to the Mariners game, to a suite at the Mariners game. And as I sat at home thinking about this whole game, I thought either I can watch it on TV or I can go to the game. In less than 24 hours after surgery, I was at a Mariners game with my clients. You know, when I think about that, it's remarkable. And what's remarkable is what surgery can do. And my guest today is going to tell you a lot more about it, because he is the CEO of Mimic Simulations, Jeff Berkley. Welcome to the program, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start with your background?
Certainly. Well, I grew up in San Diego, did my undergrad at UC San Diego, where my focus was biomedical engineering. I continued my grad school work at Northwestern, where I stuck with biomedical engineering, and I worked in a prosthetics orthotics lab, where I did a computer modeling methodology to predict deformation and stress and strain in residual limbs, the purpose being to design better prosthetics in the socket that attaches the prosthetic to the residual limb. And while I was there was a professor named Scott Delp who knew some of the work that I was doing and asked, hey, this deformation modeling that you're doing, do you think you could do this in real time? It turns out he was one of the very first to create an application called surgery simulation, where he was taking tendons and finding out if you can move them and shorten their lengths, and as a result, affect somebody's gait, the way they walk. And at the time, I had no idea. I decided to give it a go and was introduced to the field of surgery simulation. This was back in the mid-90s. So he had created this application, wrote his first paper only in about 88, 89. So it was very new, but it really got me hooked. So I came here to the University of Washington, did my PhD work in modeling for the purposes of surgery simulation. And the reason I was interested is it was very clear to me that there was a real need to train surgeons outside of the practice on patients, because the reality is much of the learning that takes place even today happens inside the operating room. And the simulation that was introduced at the time was really pretty crude. It just so happened that surgery simulation came on the scene when laparoscopic surgery first came on the scene, because in the mid-'80s there were a ton of mistakes and people were dying as a result of this surgery. Everybody could see that there could be tremendous value, but the surgeons that were practicing it were called butchers. There's no way they should be attempting this type of technique. Of course, this is something that's standard now, but the simulators,
the laparoscopic surgery,
correct. But the simulation that was being used to try to teach people this technique was very much a video game technique. I mean, it's clear when you take an organ, you stretch it, it goes 5 times the length of the organ. It's probably not a very realistic simulation. So the thinking is maybe a more mathematical approach using techniques like finite element analysis to model deformation of tissue. This is how you would model the frame of a car if you want to see how it's going to bend in a simulation of a car crash, or where your cell phone's going to break if you drop it. So this was something that was being used a lot. It just hadn't been used in real time. It's one thing to run a simulation where you can press go and then go get some coffee or go home for the evening and come back and get the results. It's quite another thing if first you have to fool your eyes, which means somewhere between 30 and 60 updates a second so that you can see a smooth animation. But your sense of touch is even more challenging, about 300 updates a second. So that's 300 calculations if you're going to model soft tissues. And if you're going to model rigid objects, it gets way into the thousands. So this was something I was interested in. And as a result, I decided when I was finishing my school to start a company to invest in this. I was fortunate to meet an engineer called, his name's Dr. Si-Hak Kim. He had created a haptic technology that allowed you to have the sense of touch in virtual reality applications. So we decided to create a company. We didn't really have an application, but we got it started, and as a result, we ended up focusing on robotic surgery simulation because it was an application where you really didn't have a way to train outside of the OR. Most hospitals only own one robot, and they can cost around $1.8 million. So how are you going to train if the robot is always in the OR being used for surgery? So we thought this was a good application, and I'll tell you, we certainly tried some other things that didn't work, but eventually this ended up being a pretty successful application. It was something. It was something. Unfortunately, we started the company in 2001. It brought on some business guys that were going to be the CEO and CFO, and I was just going to be the CTO. Of course, a little thing like the .com crash can kind of kill a company's hopes of raising money. So it was soon a company of one, and CX was working from Korea. So it was a very slow going, but as such, we still have this to this day have not raised a single dollar of outside money, but it's become the fastest adopted simulator in history.
Hold on, we're coming to a commercial break. Don't go away, because there's more to the story, and you want to hear what he has to say. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
About Money. We'll resume in a moment with Mike Adams on Business Radio 1300 KKOL. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Creating and maintaining wealth has been the specialty of Adams Financial Concepts for over 20 years. Every portfolio managed by Adams Financial Concepts is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. The client's interest always comes first in portfolio decisions. Call Mike Adams today at 206-903-1019 or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com to check out their AFC performance. They welcome your review. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. You can even listen to.
Now we return to About Money. There's more information waiting for you at adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here again is your host, Mike Adams.
So I'm here talking with the CEO of Mimic Simulations, Jeff Berkeley. We were talking about the process of getting Mimic Simulations going. It became a one-man company, and of course it's not that anymore. But the haptic technology, talk about what haptic technology does.
Certainly. Haptics indicates a sense of touch. So if you see that your tool collides with tissue, you would get a reaction force. So as you push into the tissue, it would push back. Now, typically, you're looking into a viewer and you don't really see what your hands are doing, but you would see something collide with tissue. Your hand would be connected to cables or a linkage-based system. And if you look down at your hands, you would see it hit something invisible in the air, and you would feel it. And it really adds a lot to the experience for virtual reality applications, and certainly we think it's got a lot of application for the future of medicine.
I would think so, because if you just have a game where you have a joystick or whatever, you don't really get the feedback. Where when you're cutting tissue or you run into a bone or whatever, what you're doing is creating the actual feel in somebody's hand of having done that, even though it's a simulation and not real.
Absolutely. A lot of medicine is very tactile. So if you're going to train, you need to train and react to the haptics that are involved in a procedure. So I think the thing that's sort of ironic is here we put all this investment into haptic technology, and there's really only one robot on the scene right now, the Da Vinci robot, which is what we simulate, and the haptic capabilities are rather limited. The robot is fantastic in that it applies incredible dexterity, just like there's limitations to what your eye can see. You use microscopes and videos to blow up the display. There are limitations to what your hand can do. And at this point, the robot's very good for, say, filtering out your trimmer. It can magnify your motions. For example, you move 5 centimeters, it moves 1 centimeter. You can do a lot of very interesting things of controlling multiple instruments and switching between instruments, but the sense of touch is still lacking. And this is one of the sacrifices when you go to robotic surgery from open surgery or even laparoscopic surgery. It seems the further away you get from the patient, the less of a sense of touch you have. But we're firm believers that future robots are really going to employ haptic technologies. And even if your robot doesn't have haptic capabilities, we think there's lots of applications to use haptics in training.
So in talking about the whole idea of simulating surgeries, right now, prior to the simulation, and not everybody's gone through the simulation, of course, but prior to that time, where did the surgeons learn to do their surgery?
Typically, the process would be for robotics, and certainly the path is not too different for other types of surgery. You would go to a class to learn how to use the instrumentation. Typically, this is provided by the vendor, by the company, in this case, Intuitive Surgical. And then you would come back to your institution. You would view some cases. You might even serve the role as the surgical assist, which is a surgeon that sits, or a nurse, that would sit by the patient and use laparoscopic instruments to help with the robotic surgeon. And then you would have some cases observed, but a lot of your training actually happens on patients. The reason is that it's very, very difficult to simulate the experience outside of the human body.
Yeah.
Prostatectomy is typically learned by operating on pigs. Only one problem, the pig doesn't have a prostate. So an animal's a very small, or a very poor substitute for the human. So a lot of times there's severe limitations to what you can learn outside the body, but we feel simulation can really bridge that gap.
So, you know, a person that's doing prostatectomy, how long would it take without the simulation for them to learn how to do that?
Everybody's different. Some people just have innate ability and can pick it up very fast. Other people can take quite a long time. Back in the early 2000s, I once observed a case, and this was a laparoscopic prostatectomy. And the surgery just looked so tedious and difficult to me. So I asked the surgeon, how long did this take you to get good at this? And he's like, well, about 70 or 80 cases. So to me, this was shocking. I mean, would you want to be that number 2, that number 3 individual? Do you want to really be on the learning curve? But that's it. And this isn't just robotics. This is most surgery. So I think there's a real opportunity to get people up the learning curve long before they ever touch a patient, and that's what simulation offers.
And aren't there a number of surgeries problems or errors?
It's sadly very, very high. Nearly 25% of patients do suffer because of a medical mistake. There was a report in 2010 called "To Err is Deadly." To err is to err is human. To delay is deadly. This report indicated that nearly 100,000 people were dying due to medical errors. Now, this also includes errors related to drugs, but this is a big number. So if you try to get your head around this, this is the equivalent of 5 jumbo jets crashing full of people every single week. This makes medical errors the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. And that report says that these estimates were very, very conservative.
That's amazing. You know, it seemed like one of the positives from Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is that they don't pay you to redo work. It almost seems like prior to that, if you made a mistake and went back in for a second surgery, you got the charge for that. If it needed a third surgery, you got the charge for that. It was almost an incentive to make mistakes.
Absolutely. You could imagine how you would feel as if you paid a lot of money to have your transmission fixed, and if you left and it didn't work and you had to go back in and have it fixed again, and they told you, well, it's going to be full price again, you'd be a little upset. But when insurance is covering it, a lot of people just don't really see the charges.
Yeah.
So what's nice now is the fact that you get paid for doing it once, and if your complications are high, you can lose some of your government funding. This really incentivizes hospitals to make sure that people are trained very well so that they do their surgeries not only correctly so that you don't have any complications later on down the line and have readmissions due to errors, but also you want to be efficient. Surgery is still a moneymaker. So you really can't afford to do a 9-10 hour prostatectomy. It's not going to be cost effective. You're going to lose money as a program. With training, you can be faster, more efficient, and you might be able to do 7 or 8 in a day.
And do them better.
That is the
fewer
ultimate
mistakes.
goal. And the thing that really bothers me is a lot of times when we look at mistakes and we look at programs, we look at it after the fact. And what simulation provides is the ability to measure a surgeon's performance, and you break it down into things like metrics. So let's say you have a surgical task. You can measure the time it takes them to do it. You can measure their economy of motion. How efficient are they from moving from point A to point B? Are they applying the wrong energy? Are they applying too much force to the tissue, or is it bleeding too much? In a simulated environment, you know everything that happens. So you can measure it. So you can essentially give somebody a scorecard before they ever get into surgery. So imagine if you were able to train for multiple hours and reach a level of proficiency which is comparable to experts that are already doing the surgery, and have that behind you before you do your very first surgery. You're going to feel more confident. You're going to really shorten that learning curve. Obviously, this is a way to manage risk for a hospital, but it's certainly better for the patients.
Yeah. It is an amazing thing. So we have talked mostly about surgery. We haven't talked much about the company. Tell us about what the company Mimic Simulations actually is involved with. You have a couple training centers, right?
Absolutely. So we build the equipment, and we also apply this to training directly. Of course, the robot vendor does the vast majority of the training, but I think besides Intuitive Surgical, I think we do the second most amount of training. We have a training center in Florida, part of the Florida Hospital Nicholson Center, which does more surgeon training than really any other center of the world, I believe. We also have a training center in France, and we're looking to develop training centers in China and New York. So it's we really want to provide this opportunity, but we also have simulators that typically the way it works is you would go to a training class, and we would maybe give you a day worth of simulation. We might combine this with a class with the vendor where you might get some animal training, but at least when you get in and start operating on that animal, you know what the 7 foot pedals on the robot do. You know what the buttons on the touchscreen do. You're not learning how to drive the car before you're forced to navigate the streets of San Francisco. So we hope to make it more efficient for when you can practice your surgical technique. But furthermore, we want to evaluate you when you get in. We want to show that the training that we give you is improving you. We want to show you measurable results so that we can show you're better when you leave the class. And then when you go back to your own institution, about 80% of the folks that have robots do have a simulator now. You can continue to train.
Fantastic. Tremendous company. Thanks for being on. You know, Jeff Blakely, it's a huge difference for surgery. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
Lots of people manage investment portfolios. Just a few can manage a successful portfolio and provide exceedingly great service to their clients. Here's Mike Adams from Adams Financial Concepts.
We believe the price you pay should be based on the performance of your portfolio and the quality of service you receive.
You know, Mike, it seems that a lot of companies subscribe to the one-size-fits-all mentality of investing. Does one size really fit all?
Not with us. Every portfolio that we manage is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. We place our clients' interests first in all portfolio decisions.
If you're looking for a home for your 7-figure plus investment portfolio, call Mike Adams of Adams Financial Concepts, specializing in creating and maintaining wealth for over 20 years. 206-903-1019. That's 206-903-1019. Or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Bound.org.
We're back with more About Money. For details on what you hear on today's show, visit adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Now, here again is Mike Adams.
So there's a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Back when I was growing up, a long time ago, I had a teacher that asked us to memorize this poem. I don't know why. But anyway, the poem goes like this. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive that remembers that famous day and year of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So imagine that, and I'm taking this from a book that I really enjoyed reading, and I thought I would share. And the book says, imagine for a moment, it's 1923. Al Capone's assembling an army of gun-toting henchmen in Chicago. They will number 700 before he's through. Cotton farmers in the South are sunk in depression. The Ku Klux Klan is on the rise. Newspaper headlines tell of corruption in the Veterans Bureau. The director had to resign. Rumors in the Capitol hint of the coming Teapot Dome scandal. Eventually, 2 secretaries in the cabinet will go to jail convicted of corruption. But these are not the things that concern the President of the United States. What worries Warren Harding, touring the country on a campaign swing that will prove to be his last, is a recent attack on the legend of Paul Revere. An iconoclast had noted that Revere never really completed the ride that was made famous by Longfellow. Before giving warning to Concord, Revere was discovered by the British and captured. Harding, however, told the crowd he didn't care. I love the story of Paul Revere, the president intoned in his most presidential sounding voice. I love the story of Paul Revere, whether he rode or not. With all that going on. The book goes on to say, we may be scandalized today that Harding in 1923 and that story, but I think we're less cynical than we think we are. The evidence suggests we're just as susceptible to mythology as Americans were in the past. The danger is not that we have myths. The danger is hiding from the fact that they are myths. The book is I Love Paul Revere, Whether He Wrote or Not, by Richard Schenkman. 1991, Richard Schenkman is a professor at the University of Washington, has written these books. I think it's a great book. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's fun to read. He also wrote One Night Stands with American History, and I can't remember a couple other books, but they're fun to read. They've got all sorts of little things in the book that are fun to read about. But as I survey the stock market and modern portfolio theory and financial planning, I wonder if many experts are susceptible to that same mythology. Beliefs widely held, in my opinion, that are really not valid at all. It's my opinion only, but I think the facts back it up that financial planning, that modern portfolio theory do not hold up. And there's 2 approaches to financial planning. What I called the current one, the most popular and most subscribed to, is, and people go to colleges to learn certified financial planning. They take courses, continuing education. It takes a lot of study and materials and testing. There's software programs. I remember when I opened Adams Financial Concepts, the very best financial planning software you could get was NaviPlan. Cost $4,000 or $5,000. I sent my sales assistant at the time, paid $4,000 or $5,000 to have her trained in it. We produced the first financial plan. It was like 400 pages long. It was huge and detailed. And I read through it, and I threw up my hands. I got discouraged. I looked at the assumptions. I looked at what was going on. It was a beautiful report. It was multicolored charts and graphs and explanations and forecasts and simulations, Monte Carlo simulations, since we were talking about simulations today. It had all these things. And it was all based on a normal curve. It was all based on things which do not fit the market. Financial planning. 1987. I started the program talking about 1987 and biotechnology. 1987 was the big push in the big brokerage houses for financial planning. We had the crash, October 19th, 1987. The market dropped almost as much in one day as it did in 1929. It was a huge drop. It was a panic time. There were people that predicted that we were going to be in terrible shape. I remember that a wholesaler came into the office, and I was new. I was a year into the business, a little over a year in the business. And the wholesaler came into the office and said, $1 trillion has gone out of the economy. You're going to be able to walk into Nordstrom's this weekend and hear a pin drop. Now, this is October. This is coming up to Christmas. I remember that story. I went home. I told my wife, we got to go to Nordstrom's. This wholesaler said, you'll be able to walk into Nordstrom's and hear a pin drop. It's going to be so empty. You know, that weekend we went to Nordstrom's. We could hardly get into the store. There were so many people there. I said to my wife, they must not have heard that the stock market lost $1 trillion. Somebody didn't tell them, you know. But there was a lot of fear that went on. And suddenly, most of the business that was being done in 1987 was transaction business. You bought, you sold, and you got paid when you bought, when you sold. It was not the fee-based business that many of us do today. You know, today if the market drops a whole lot, your revenues go down because the accounts go down, but you still continue to get revenues. In transaction business, if you're not buying and selling, you make no money. And in that course, in that response, Payne Weber came up with this idea of a CD that they put out. The idea was to gather in assets. Merrill Lynch came up with the idea of financial planning, and they required their financial advisors, or the other thing that happened in 1987 is stockbrokers became financial advisors. They had to do away with the stockbroker term, became financial advisors. So Merrill, or financial consultants, Merrill came up with this idea of requiring their financial advisors to sell at least one financial plan. I don't know whether it was a year or a month or whatever. The idea was to spend $245 to do this plan. But the real idea was to find out where people had all their money and then to take the approach, let's consolidate into one place. So that the whole idea was to bring the money in, and by bringing the money in is to create more revenues for the company. It wasn't about things have gone wrong, we need to plan better, people need to plan better. Not at all. The idea of the financial planning as it got going, as it continued to go, and goes even today, is to identify where people keep all their money. And once you identify where they have all their money, then you can push to consolidate. And when you consolidate, you can then have control over the assets and make more money. I don't believe in consolidating assets. I believe you should probably have a couple different financial advisors and compare their returns. If somebody gets 4% and somebody gets 10% over a couple of years, you know what you should do. You know who you should fire and who you should hire. I mean, I believe in that. I advise clients that. I just had a new client that I recommended that they put and keep their current financial advisor who hadn't done very well and compare. I can tell you another story about that as well. But that's in the process. That's how financial planning came into being. That's the reason it's used. It is not always in the client's best interest. It's for sure in the firm's best interest. That wraps it up for today. I will be back next week, and maybe I'll spend some more time talking about financial planning and the different ways to do it. I'll be back next week. Have a great weekend. And remember, we've been talking about money.
You've been listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you want Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared on the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Friday afternoon at 3 for more About Money with Mike Adams, here on Money Radio 1300 KKOL.
The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Creating and maintaining wealth has been the specialty of Adams Financial Concepts for over 20 years. Every portfolio managed by Adams Financial Concepts is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. The client's interest always comes first in portfolio decisions. Call Mike Adams today at 206-903-1019 or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com to check out their AFC performance. They welcome your review. That's Adams Financial